Thanks so much for joining us today. In follow-up to our last big education event in April, we are thrilled to have A2 Milk with us here this morning, sponsoring today's webinar. My name is Annette Maggi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Retail Dietitians Business Alliance. This webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit, and the certificate of attendance will be sent out to all attendees following today's webinar. Additionally, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the retaildietitians.com website within 1 week. So today, our focus is on Beyond the Plate, a global perspective on milk, and we are thrilled to have Maya Feller here with us. So Maya, I am going to turn it over to you and let you get started. Just one final note for our attendees, please put any questions that you have in the chat feature versus the Q&A feature throughout the webinar, and you can enter them at any time during the webinar. Maya, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Annette. It is such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to our sponsor, A2 Milk. So I'm really glad that all of you have chosen to spend some time with us and to really take a look beyond the plate and really preliminarily examine milk consumption and trends across cultures. Now, as supermarket dietitians and retail dietitians, your reach is incredibly wide. I mean, it's as wide as it is diverse. So some of you, I know you create educational materials. Some of you actually engage in in-store counseling. Some of you might actually facilitate cooking classes or even demos. And some of you may lead store tours. I know that there's a lot that you do. And so my hope is really that you take this global perspective on milk and incorporate it into your work. But before we dive in, I want to tell you just a tiny bit about me. So I'm a registered dietitian and I'm based in Brooklyn, and I provide direct medical nutrition therapy services to patients who are living with or at risk of developing a non-communicable condition. And in my practice, our focus is really providing patient-centered care from an anti-bias approach. So you'll hear a lot of that woven into our talk today. All right, so this is a robust side set, and the learning objectives are to define foodways, that term, gain an understanding of rates of global dairy consumption, to be able to describe the role of milk in global food culture, and to gain an understanding of the potential advantages of consuming A2 milk as an alternative to conventional milk. So I have no actual or potential conflicts of interest in relation to this presentation. I am just a happy A2 milk drinker. All right, so we don't actually have a poll. So what I'm actually going to ask everyone to do is to please drop into the chat feature if you do drink milk, just a simple yes or no, so I can see what everyone is saying. All right, I see some yeses coming in. All right, I see a couple yeses coming in. Okay, awesome. Not regular cow's milk. Okay, that's exciting. So there's some yeses coming in. So far we've got a few milk drinkers out there. Now, there are a number of reasons why people drink milk, right? And so people drink milk because it's protein rich, right? And it's a great source of nutrients, and it's packed with vitamins and minerals. And it also includes some of the underconsumed nutrients of concern. So we're talking specifically about calcium, potassium, vitamin D. It's also a really great source of vitamin A, magnesium, zinc, and thiamine. Also, milk tastes great, right? It's really versatile, and it can be used alone or with meals. It can also be incorporated into a number of cooking techniques, and it can also be transferred into various products. So we know that it shows up in butter and cheese. And you all know firsthand all the forms that milk takes as it shows up in the stores that you're working in. So what are some of the reasons why people don't drink milk? on the other hand, there are some people that may not be able to actually digest milk, or they might simply choose not to drink milk. Like I saw someone in the chat say that they don't drink regular cow's milk. And some of these reasons are lactose intolerance that's listed here. And as RDs, you're really familiar with this, right? And you may have actually developed educational materials towards centered around, lower lactose or lactose-free options that are in your stores. Now, we all know that lactose in cow's milk can be difficult for some people to digest, right? And what happens is that it results in side effects, and they can be far-ranging, including nausea, gas, cramping, bloating, diarrhea. They're really unwanted, and that would cause any person to really avoid consuming a lactose-rich product. One of the things that we do know is that adults actually tend to develop lactose intolerance later in life. And this intolerance typically worsens over time and leads to progressively worse symptoms. So that's very interesting. Now, another reason why people may not drink milk is because of an actual milk allergy. So let's be clear, like intolerance versus allergy. Now, milk allergies are different from lactose intolerance because milk allergies can be potentially strong and dangerous reactions such as anaphylaxis and vomiting. Now, milk allergies, there's an actual IgE-mediated reaction, right? That's very different from lactose intolerance, where someone's just simply unable to actually digest lactose. And with the IgE reaction, it's really to the protein. So it's the casein and whey that are in milk. And every time a person who has a milk allergy consumes milk with these proteins, the body recognizes that protein, and it signals the body to release a histamine and other chemicals, and that can cause those wide range of symptoms. Now, let's do a little deep dive or a preliminary dive into lactose intolerance, right? So lactose intolerance, on the other hand, it's really just an intolerance. It's absolutely not life-threatening. It's uncomfortable and unwanted, but it is not fatal for most. And basically, it's the impaired ability to break down lactose, right? That's the sugar that's found in milk and other dairy products. And so the body typically is able to break down lactose by the enzyme lactase, which is produced in the cells of the small intestine. And people who are lactose intolerant actually produce insufficient amounts of lactase in the small intestine. So this is where we see some symptoms that show up, and usually they show up within 30 minutes of consuming a lactose-rich dairy product. Now, lactose intolerance in adulthood is actually very common. Now we're going to take a look at this from a cultural perspective or the global perspective in people of East Asian descent. Actually, about 70 to 100% of them are actually affected. And approximately 65% of the total human population actually has a reduced ability to digest lactase after infancy. So if we're thinking about the prevalence of lactose intolerance, it is variable among different ethnicities. It's really common in African Americans, people who identify as Latinx, and Asians also tend to be more affected. And it's least prevalent among people who are of European descent. So people who identify as white Europeans. Lactose intolerance is the least common in populations with a historical dependency on consuming fermented milk products as a crucial component of their food sources. So for example, only 5% of people from Northern Europe are lactose intolerant. So I want you all to think about all of the lower lactose or lactose-free dairy products that are available to the shoppers in your stores, and whether or not these are things that you actually point out to them in discussions that you're having. As previously noted, there's a really wide variation in the prevalence of lactose malabsorption around the world. Now, all humans can digest milk in infancy, or I should say most, right? If someone has, galactostemia, absolutely not, right? However, the ability to do so as an adult really evolved only until recently. And what we see is that there are a number of mutations that really have allowed adults to produce the enzyme lactase that breaks down lactose. These mutations, they actually spread rapidly as individuals had a significant evolutionary advantage. And that was due to the nutrient profile and the antibodies from cow milks, which may have protected against infection. Isolated populations such as indigenous Australian people, so known as the Aborigines, people who are Japanese, and also indigenous Americans have high rates of lactose intolerance. Now, when we look at areas that have a warmer climate, like think around the Mediterranean or Africa, right? There are 22 nations around the Mediterranean Sea. They tend to actually have higher rates of lactose intolerance in comparison to colder areas in Northern Europe. And that's due to the fact that there is greater availability of different food sources, and there was less of an evolutionary advantage in possessing the gene variant that would break down lactose. Now, I personally think that this is really interesting because it informs traditions and cultural food norms. So let's take a look at global rates of lactose intolerance. Now we see that lactose intolerance is very common, affecting about 95% of Asian Americans, 74% of indigenous people living in the US, or indigenous Americans, I should say, 70% of African Americans, 53% of Mexican Americans, and 15% of Caucasians, so white people who are of Northern European descent. And that's, I'm gonna put that little caveat in there based on what we just heard before. All right, so I wanna share a story with you. Now, this will be one of the first kind of case study stories that I share in our time together. So when I think it must have been in my first year of undergrad, I really started spending some significant time in Switzerland. And it was mostly around summer. And I was with my then boyfriend, who's my now husband. And I grew up in an Afro-Caribbean family. So that's my kind of, heritage. And I would say that in my home, we were low to moderate milk consumers. Now, my first summer in Switzerland, I should say that, I learned that dairy plays a significant part of like the Swiss foodways. I mean, when we think about Switzerland, right, we think about like Alps, we think about cows on the Alp with like bells, we think about delicious cheese, we think about milk chocolate. I mean, that's like what a lot of us think about when we think about Switzerland, maybe also watches as well. But I really learned on this trip that dairy was a significant part of their foodway. And I would say I dove headfirst into the dairy experience coming from like a low dairy consuming household. I was drinking lattes and cappuccinos like multiple times per day. I was eating dairy-based soups and dressings. I mean, really going heavy on the cream. And I began to feel digestive discomfort and thought that it may have been associated with my increased milk consumption. When I got back to the US that summer, I was bedridden for 3 days in so much pain. And I had such lasting discomfort that I actually decided to visit a doctor. And that's when I was diagnosed with lactose intolerance. And I can tell you all of my subsequent trips to Switzerland, I consume significantly less milk. And I also am very vocal about what I need when I go into places. All right, so let's take a look for poll 2. And this, again, you're going to drop into the chat. I'd love to know how you identify. Do you identify as Black? Do you identify as white? The categories here are listed the same way that they're listed in the census. So that's why we say Hispanic, American Indian, Asian, or mixed heritage. So these are the census kind of categories. All right, I'm going to open up the chat and see. Okay, so we have some people coming in, and so far our respondents are saying that they identify as white. Okay, and if you want, you can. We have someone saying that they identify as mixed. I also wanted to say that you can just put it into the host and panelists if you don't feel comfortable sharing to the full group. Okay, great. Now, here's the next question. Is milk an important part of your dietary heritage? Right, so in my story, I shared that as a person of Afro-Caribbean descent, we were low milk consumers, and it was not something that was a significant portion of my dietary heritage. Okay, so I see someone saying that they're from a dairy family. People are saying yes, yes, yes. Okay, that's great to know. Okay, and some people are saying no. Okay, thank you guys for participating. I appreciate it. Okay. So, the responses are, I'd say we have more people that identify as dairy being a part of their foodway. So here we're taking a look at annual consumption of cow's milk, and these numbers are as of 2020. So this is to give you an idea. In the US, we consume over 46 million pounds of milk, because this is in metric tons. In the EU, over 73 million pounds are consumed. And in India, over 178 million pounds are consumed. That's a lot of milk. Now, most of the world's largest milk consumers per person are actually located in Europe. And the dairy industry is the second largest agricultural sector in the EU. And the prevalence of lactose intolerance, as I previously mentioned, is low in many European countries, specifically Central and Northern Europe. And so what we see here is that the 10 largest milk consumers by country are Finland, Montenegro, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, my beloved Switzerland, Albania, Lithuania, Ireland, Kazakhstan, and Estonia. Now, the lowest milk consumers per person are mostly located, as you can see here, in Asia and Africa. And the prevalence of lactose intolerance is high in these regions. So we see Laos, Liberia, Cambodia, North Korea, Burundi, Mozambique, Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, and Nigeria. I would love you all to think, okay, have you encountered people in your retail situations who actually identify as being from high milk consumers or low milk consumers? Now, drinking milk is really associated with culture. And when I want to say culture, I want to go back and kind of say that, we all have culture. Culture are the social norms that any group, subscribes to. So everyone has culture. This is not unique to racial and ethnic minorities. Now, there is a cultural symbolism around milk. And it's really associated, especially in the US, with kind of becoming American and fitting in. It actually reminds me of a patient of mine who moved to the US from the English-speaking Caribbean, and they talked about actually changing the foods that they consumed and beverages that they drank so that they could fit in. We also see that milk is associated with tradition, right? So there are many cultures that have traditional dishes that include milk. And as we move around the globe, we start to see what they look like, what shape they take, the time of day that they show up. And I also want you all to think about, and I believe that in many stores, there's a kind of a global food aisle, like how many of those things are dairy based, right? Or versus how many are not. And then also think about like the yogurt case, like how many different types of yogurt they are and where they come from in the world. The cultural significance of milk goes really well beyond the nutritional value, right? There are shifting socioeconomic and political reasons that influence how people perceive the importance and the value of milk, and as well as how much they consume. Because milk is a good source of protein and nutrients, it's often a staple on the shopping list for families, of especially people with small children, among others. Now, in the US, cow's milk has long been a privileged food, but its consumption is actually declining in America despite the massive milk industry. And the reasons for this are, I would say, multifactorial, and some are related to cost and some are sociopolitical. Interestingly enough, I want you all to go back to a few slides in your mind and remember that India actually had, some high milk consumption. Interestingly enough, it's actually out of reach for many of the people, but the consumption is rising really rapidly among the urban middle class. And I think that that's so interesting from the perception or lens of access. So there are some shifts in global consumption of milk. Large-scale milk production and consumption has really historically been localized in European populations, so European countries. And what we see in countries that with the global food patterns, there are huge changes in terms of the increases in milk consumption, such as places like Asia. And in markets that have large populations, such as Indonesia and Asia, there is rapid growth as well, just as I previously noted, right? And with this growth, we're seeing an increase in milk consumption. So if we then think about Latin America, this is also an area where there's fast growing dairy markets, specifically in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. And interesting, as we previously noted, right, in North America, we see that there's been a 22% decrease from 2000 to 2016. So there's actually a typo here. It's actually from 2000 to 2016, we see that there's been a decrease by 22% in milk consumption. And in the EU, there's been a higher per capita consumption, even though the dairy market has been in decline for a number of years. And again, the reasons here are multifactorial, and some of them are linked to the shifts in consumer trends. Now, I want to take a look around the acculturation of milk and milk consumption. So what we see is that people who are foreign-born and US-born and identify as Latinx actually have very different perceptions in the consumption of dairy products. So if we're looking at the National Eating Trend Survey, milk is actually the #2 at-risk beverage for Latinx people who acculturate. So I'm talking about people who come to the US and actually begin to engage in American patterns of eating. What we see is that US-born Latinx individuals tend to actually mirror these consumption patterns of the general US population. However, foreign-born Latinx individuals appear to be completely different consumers and actually increase their milk consumption as they adopt certain consumption patterns in mainstream America. We see this not only with dairy, but also with the standard American diet. So like the pattern of eating, people come into the US and they actually engage in overconsumption of, US foods as a way to fit in. And now milk consumption is actually much lower if we're looking in Mexico, like we're going to leave the US and we're going to look in Mexico. It's much lower there than in the US. However, data suggests that Mexican individuals increase their consumption of milk once they arrive in the US, and as they acculturate, right, their milk consumption decreases. So once they arrive in the US, they drink more milk, but then once they acculturate, right, they come into the culture and fall into a pattern, the consumption then again decreases. So this graph really shows that the more acculturated a person is, the less milk that they actually consume. So it's really, really interesting. And studies also have shown that in households where people are Spanish speakers, they actually tend to buy 59% more milk than English-speaking dominant households. And the reasons for this, again, are multifactorial, but we do know that milk, and this is what the data says, carries a certain symbolic association with mainstream America. And so sometimes recent immigrants actually consume milk in order to adopt a more American lifestyle. I want you to think about, my Caribbean patient who came here and started to drink more milk to fit in. So here are some dairy traditions in Latin America. I want to say that this is just a sampling. And I also want to really call out that as I go through these traditions, I want to say that they're not monolithic in any way, and that they may show up in some, homes, and they may not. But this is just a sampling to give you an idea. So we see that blended fruit and milk is something that can show up for breakfast. And in some research, about 70% of foreign-born folks who identify as Latinx said that they actually have batidos at least once a week. And 38% of US-born Latinx people say that they have batidos once weekly. So people who are foreign-born tend to consume more batidos than people who are born here. And then there is a corn-based drink that's sometimes made with milk. And it's a popular drink that's consumed on Day of the Dead. And it seems that people who are less acculturated consume it less than people who are US born. So 1 in 5 less acculturated versus 1 in 10 US born. Now we have Horchata, which is a sweet cinnamon-infused rice-based drink, and it's also sometimes made with milk. Tends to show up in some Mexican patterns of eating. And for people who were surveyed in this study, about a quarter of them said that they had it throughout the day. Then there's some dairy-based desserts like flan or tres leches, or rice pudding, arroz con leche, that shows up. And we see in terms of percentage, about 27% of US-born Latinx individuals consume these dairy desserts, compared with about 36% of people who are less acculturated. It's interesting, right? And if you're thinking about the materials that you're putting together for your populations, perhaps some of these dairy-based desserts are going to show up, and it's something that you can, encourage all people to try the recipes out and consume. Now, when we're looking at some of the patterns across Africa, and again, this is like a kind of broad look, we see that milk has been in the past an important part of pastoral civilizations in Africa. And it's also been important in social organization, eating habits, and trading. And it's an important part of the local culture and heritage. And there have been some spiritual and ritual symbolic representations where we see dairy showing up. And as you can see in this slide, there is economic value, but there's also a social and cultural value. The indigenous groups, so people of the Maasai, the Baruni, the Fulani, and the Tuaregs, have a strong historic dairy tradition. You'll notice that many of the beverages that show up in these patterns are actually fermented. And it seems that the fermentation helps to reduce the risk of unwanted bacterial growth and improves the shelf life and food safety. And this would make sense if we're thinking also about the temperature in some of these places, right? So you see that there's a link to the culture and the history, but also about the topography of the areas that we're talking about. Now, if we look at some dairy traditions in Asia, in Mongolia, milk has been a core ingredient of the Mongolian pattern of eating. So it's cow's milk, we see goat milk, we see mare milk, we see camel milk, all consumed. So it's not just cow's milk. And there are a number of traditional dishes, maybe a milk bean curd, also milk drags, we see cheese, yogurt crisps that show up. So in China, there are also some traditional milk dishes. We see milk buns, milk rolls. In other parts of China, we see fried milk. We also see double skim milk. There's ginger milk. So they're showing up in all sorts of different ways. And then in India, you all may be familiar with gulab jamun, which is a delicious dessert. It's quite sweet and wonderful. And that's also dairy-based. Now, if we take a look a little deeper at milk consumption in China, we see that there was this explosive growth of milk consumption. And it's been estimated that about 92% of adults actually have trouble absorbing lactose. And so most recently, China's Preventative Medicine Agency has suggested that by the time children are 11 to 13 years old, actually about 40% of them have really lost this ability to digest milk. So you've heard this before, right? That in this slide set, that people, as they age, the ability to digest milk decreases. And here's a fun fact. So when the People's Republic of China was founded in the 1940s, its national dairy herd consisted of over 120,000 cows. And now today, China is actually the third largest milk producer in the world with over 13 million dairy cows. And so with that explosion, we've seen a significant increase with the average person. They've gone from barely drinking milk at all to consuming around 30 kilograms of dairy per day. And it's interesting, right? Because there is a significant increase in the milk consumption. However, we also see that there is a large part of the population, 92%, that have trouble absorbing the lactose. Now let's take a look in Japan. Now, globalization really does shift milk consumptions. And in Japan, what we're seeing around the consumption of milk and dairy products is that there was a significant growth as these countries became more westernized. So during this specific period, so from 1912 to about 1926, there was momentum that started to build for the incorporation of cow's milk into actual food products in the home and not just a substitute for breast milk. So there was this real kind of push toward consuming cow's milk. And also in this same time period, there were a lot of advancements around nutrition research, as well as this discovery of the vitamins and minerals. So what we saw was that it was believed that drinking milk was the best way to improve the physical buildup of bone due to the high calcium content. And in many Japanese patterns of eating, actually dairy is such a great way for people to get calcium into their pattern of eating and into their body. So approximately 80% of Japanese people who were surveyed actually acknowledge the importance of milk, and they think that it's important for them to drink, especially to become strong and tall and to maintain good health. Okay, so here is a poll question number 3 about foodways, right? So is milk a part of your foodway individually? Or you can also answer if milk is a part of the foodways for the people that you are writing nutrition education content for people that you're engaged in counseling with. does milk show up in the foodway? I see some people saying most definitely. Yes, okay. So milk is showing up as strong in people's foodways, and it's something that you all take into consideration in your work. So the next question, well, it's not a question, but here I want to say foodways, and I want to give you the definition is, foodways are the intersection between food, culture, tradition, and history. So foodways are all the traditional activities, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors associated with the food in a person's daily life. And so foodways include customs of food production, preservation, preparation, the way that it's served, how people come to the table, how people use various food products other than for eating and food. I want you all to think about some of the lists that I provided previously, looking at some of the way that dairy showed up in Asia and in Africa, and kind of what those dishes were, sweet, some of the beverages, because it's very interesting, right? So if we take food and history and culture of our patients into consideration, it really actually offers us an opportunity to learn from their lived experience. I wonder how many people, in your counseling or in your circulars or on the blogs that you're writing, come back and say to you, oh, that really resonated with me. I felt like, you said something from my culture and I recognize that, right? So when we're in these counseling sessions, providing MMT, or if you're on grocery store tours, or as I said in your educational material, and you're having these conversations really without judgment, then people are much more likely to be able to center the shopper's experience, right? And have better outcomes. So the less bias, the more we consider foodways, the better outcomes we have with the people that we interact with. So above here, we have an infographic for what percentage of dietary energy, dietary protein, and dietary fat milk provides in Asia and Africa, and then Europe, Oceania, and the Americas. So what we see is that milk provides about 3 to 4% of the dietary energy in Africa and Asia, compared with about 9% in Europe and Oceania. About 6 to 8% of dietary protein in Asia and Africa, compared with about 19% in Europe. So these trends are staying true, right? It's starting to sound very familiar. And about 7% of dietary fat supply in Asia and Africa, and 12 to 14% in Europe, Oceania, and the Americas. This slide here is a look at milk consumption for each person around the globe. And what we see is that it's detailed by high annual consumption, and then median annual consumption, and low annual consumption. So you'll see in the high area, and again, this is starting to be a trend, you're recognizing this, we're seeing that Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Costa Rica. Now I have to pull out Argentina and Costa Rica as having significant links to European foodways. So that's just something I want to point out there. Then you'll notice in the medium that we have India, Iran, Japan, Kenya, Mexico, Mongolia. And then in the low, you'll see Vietnam, Senegal, most of Central Africa, and most of East and Southeast Asia. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to think a little bit about some of the nutritional benefits of milk. As RDs, I would love for you to drop into the chat kind of what are some of the nutritional benefits of milk that you often highlight to the populations that you're working with, whether or not it's in a blog, a circular, a grocery tour, or a food demo. What are some of the nutritional benefits of milk that you often talk about? You drop that right into the chat. I'd love to see if it's going to line up with some of the things that I'm about to say. Protein and calcium, excellent. Fat is helpful, yes, to absorb fat-soluble vitamins, calcium, iron, protein, love it. Yes, yes, yes. All right, so that's exactly what I'm going to share as well. So 1 cup of milk contains 8 grams of protein, 8 grams of fat, 20% of the RDA for calcium, so it's a really good source of calcium, and 24% of the RDA for potassium, which is also a good source of potassium, and about 14% of the RDA for phosphorus. And so, 22% of the RDA for phosphorus and 14% of the RDA for selenium. Now we know that milk it's really nutrient rich, and it also has some of those shortfall nutrients that we're always concerned about: calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. Also a great source of vitamin A, magnesium, zinc, and thiamine. And it's worth noting that there's some good research looking at dairy consumption and people who have borderline elevated blood pressure. And because of the potassium, it seems to be really, really helpful to include in the pattern of eating as a mechanism for helping to keep blood pressure within healthy limits. Now, we know that the dietary guidelines, many people living in this country don't get enough dairy in their pattern of eating. So here are some of the proven health benefits that I've gone over. It's really packed with nutrients. It's nourishing, and it's really a great source of quality protein. We know that protein is needed for growth and development, and also helps with immune system regulation and cellular repair. It's really the building block for everything. And when we're looking at the dietary guidelines, we know that many people are not getting enough milk into their pattern of eating. And so it's something that we can encourage in all of the various forms. As I said before, milk is a complete protein, so it's got all 9 of the essential amino acids that are needed for the body to function optimally. I want you to think about that graph before, where you can see, in certain parts of, Africa and Asia, it had a much smaller proportion of protein in comparison to Europe and Oceania, right? So when we're thinking about what that protein is in milk, the 2 main types are casein and whey, and they're both considered to be high biological value, really good quality sources of protein. And the casein makes up about 70 to 80% of the total protein in cow's milk, while the whey contains about 20%. Now, the whey protein contains branched chain amino acids, so it has leucine, isoleucine, and valine, and those are all linked to health benefits. Such a great recovery drink for athletes. That's something that I talk about in my practice quite often. I could absolutely imagine if you're doing a kids nutrition, or you're having a demo and it's focused on, nutrition for recovery after sports, that this could be a recovery drink. Now, another thing that we think about is bone health. 99% of the body's calcium is stored in our bones and teeth. And this combination of nutrients in milk, the calcium, the potassium, the phosphorus, and protein, they're so essential to the body's maintenance of healthy and strong bones. Now, there was a study published in 2021 in the International Journal of Obesity. And what it found was that higher milk intake was actually associated with lower cholesterol levels. And in turn, there's the possibility that this could reduce the risk of coronary artery disease. Now, it's interesting because higher milk intake is associated with greater body fat. However, it's associated with lower cholesterol. Listen, it's micronutrient rich. So we know that milk has hundreds of different fatty acids, including conjugated linoleic acid and omega-3s. And so we know that these 2 together are really important for helping to reduce the risk of heart disease and also reduce the risk of developing diabetes. And as well, there are studies that show that consuming milk, as I said, after a workout can really be a great recovery food. And what the studies say is that it can actually help to decrease muscle soreness, increase strength, promote that tissue repair in muscles, and also decrease damage to the muscle. All right. So here's a question for us. What actually is A2 milk, other than being absolutely delicious? What is it? So it contains so in general, milk contains two main proteins, as I said, right? The casein and the whey. And casein is the major protein in milk, and it has two forms. About 80% is casein, 20% is whey, and that's respectively, right? So the two main forms of casein are A1 and A2, and most milks contain predominantly A1 milk. Now, A2 milk only has the A2 protein. So you'll see the cow on the left is 100% A2 protein, and the cow on the right is going to yield half A2 protein, half A2 milk. That's what our conventional milk is. So if you're buying A2 milk, the cow has been bred only to yield A2 milk. Now, what are some of the benefits of consuming A2 milk? Now, it is actually comparable to human breast milk, as well as milk from goats, sheep, and buffalo. And research suggests that it's actually better tolerated in comparison to regular cow's milk. And specifically in individuals who may have a sensitivity to dairy. And it's likely because the symptoms that are attributed to lactose intolerance, are not going to present because A2 milk is easier to digest in general. Now, there was this new study, in 2021, a clinical study conducted by Indiana-Purdue's professor of nutrition, Deneen Silviano, who reported that people who suffer from stomach discomfort after drinking conventional milk have significantly reduced symptoms when drinking A2 milk. So it's thought that people who have a lactose intolerance or sensitivity actually may be better able to sensitize A2 milk. And so you'll see this same kind of quote here, right? So individuals who are consuming the milk only containing A2 protein really experience fewer stomach discomfort in comparison to conventional milk. So some of the properties of A2 milk, A2 milk is protein rich and has polyunsaturated fats like omega-3 fatty acids. As I mentioned, we see a lot of potassium in milk, and so A2 milk has that as well, and it may help to keep blood pressure levels steady. We also know that when we consume more omega-3 fatty acids found, like the ones found in A2 milk, you can potentially lower your cholesterol levels, shift that ratio. The other thing too is that A2 milk is really rich in vitamin D. And vitamin D has been researched as a possible adjuvant treatment for seasonal depression and seasonal affective disorder and depressive symptoms, right? So there's a link between vitamin D and mood. So I'm not saying causality, but I'm saying that there is research looking at this, and A2 milk is a rich source of vitamin D. We also know that A2 milk is a rich source of vitamin A. And vitamin A, according to the NIH, is important for, healthy vision, immune function, as well as the reproductive process. So we're thinking about vitamin A and its also response to immune health overall. Now, what does the research say? There was this very interesting study, and it was a 2019 randomized double-blind crossover study replacing conventional milk with A2 milk in dairy or milk intolerant preschoolers who were between the ages of 5 and 6. And this was a multi-center study, and it looked at 835 children in China. And so what the study, how it was conducted was that participants who consumed milk only with A2, the findings were that they had significantly reduced GI symptoms. There was improved stool consistency. Also, there was reduced stool frequency, which is something that shows up for people who have a lactose sensitivity. And this was seen in comparison to the subjects who consumed conventional milk. So this study finding really supports the use of A2 milk in intolerant populations. Now, there was another study in 2016 in China comparing the effects of regular milk that contained both A1 and A2 protein and A2 milk only. And what this study was really looking at was Chinese adults, so not children. And remember, so I'm using China because of the high prevalence of lactose intolerance, just to kind of showcase how beneficial A2 milk can be for populations who experience this significant discomfort. Now, this study also looked at intestinal function, stomach discomfort, as well as inflammation. And the participants consumed 8 ounces of milk twice a day for 2 weeks. And that's the regular milk. And those participants reported worse stomach pain and looser and more frequent stools. So for the first 2 weeks, they did that. Then they consumed A2 milk, and they reported no symptoms after drinking the A2 milk. So we can see that, it can be important information for our patients, the people that we're kind of sharing nutrition education information with. The A2 milk can be something that they should consider. All right, so here we have case study 1. And this is a case study of a dairy farmer. And so this dairy farmer, I want to talk to you about that I interviewed, talks about shifting from using mostly A1 and 2 cows to A2 cows only, and saying that there's going to be an explosion in the market of more A2 milk. And so that's really, really exciting, especially from the farming perspective, and that, dairy farmers are really the people who are bringing us the majority of our milk. Now, case study 2. So I want to point out that these case studies are not, you can't generalize them. These are just real people that I surveyed. So it's not for scientific research. It's just people who shared their information with me consuming A2 milk over the course of 10 days. So this patient of mine was a 48-year-old woman, a white woman who ate dairy products, but actually chose to avoid cow's milk entirely. And she typically consumed oat milk with her daily coffee and as a snack. And so what we had the patient do was slowly reintroduce A2 milk into the coffee, then 1 cup per day for 10 days. And it was interesting because this patient of mine had completely avoided cow's milk for so many years and didn't actually want to introduce it back in. But the outcome was that they said that A2 milk was delicious, it was sweet, it was creamy, and it actually reduced their fear of eating new foods. And this patient was able to include dairy made with A2 milk back into their pattern of eating. So that was a huge win and pretty exciting. So next, I have the Smith family. There's a family that I work with, and I work with all 4 of them. The mother, and this is an African-American family. The mother is a 44-year-old woman and consumes more cheese than milk. The father is a 45-year-old man, uses milk and cereal, and the older son also used milk and cereal, and the younger son as well. So you'll notice that the family typically drinks milk as a part of with cereal, but they really avoided animal-based milk products because they said that they experienced gas, bloating, and intestinal issues in the past. So what we had the family do was slowly begin to introduce small amounts of A2 milk to replace the soy milk. So we did less than 1 cup per day for 3 days, and then 1 cup per day for the remaining 7 days. And with the Smith family, they too noted that there was no GI distress or any side effects with the A2 milk. They said that the milk to them tasted the same as non-A2 milk. And then the patients also were really excited by being able to add dairy made with A2 proteins into their pattern of eating, and also increase the variety of meals that they were able to enjoy again. Now, this one patient of mine was a 12-year-old girl who is also African-American, who only drank oat milk and was incredibly picky. I was so surprised when I reached out to her and she said she would love to try the A2 milk. I was really surprised because this was a very picky patient. And so for this treatment, what we did was we had the patient slowly introduce small amounts of A2 milk into her morning cereal. And then we had them gradually increase the portion to more than a cup per day. This was, for me, the most shocking outcome. The patient loved the flavor, called it delicious, reported no side effects, and again, also reduced their fear of trying new foods and increased the variety of foods that she could eat. So that was a huge win for us.
This is Annette. I just want to jump in. We just have 4 minutes left, so I'm not sure if you want to move to wrap up or.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So this is the last case study, and this is the dairy farmer, as I said before. So you can just take a look at that. And here are some additional resources. And I'm happy to open the floor up for questions now in the last 4 minutes.
Yeah, Maya, thanks so much for sharing some really great information. Attendees, we do have a couple minutes for questions. So if there's anything you'd like to ask Maya in the last couple minutes here, please add that to the chat. Maya, one question I have just to kick us off is, given retail dietitians obviously doing education in the retail setting, right? What kind of advice would you have for them in kind of representing the global uses of milk and how to kind of approach that in a retail setting?
So in a retail setting, I think, going into the international foods aisle and trying to replicate some dishes in, any cooking demos or in any written materials based on what's in those aisles, because usually stores are stocking those aisles that are unique to the population that they serve. So you can use that global aisle kind of as your guide for the people that are, international folks that are going to your store, and then try to actually replicate some of those dishes and add dairy in where the dish calls for it. You can also do a twist and note that it's a twist and add dairy in, even if it doesn't call for it.
And then we have a question, Maya, if you know of any data from the dairy industry as to how fast the transition is moving to raise more cows that produce the A2 milk.
That is a wonderful question. And I think, Katie's on and she could answer that. But what I can tell you is that what I've seen in Europe and in Australia is that they have completely switched over to A2 cows. And I also know in parts of India, they're completely on A2 as well.
Okay, and then Katie, there is a question in the chat, Maya. I'm guessing you don't know necessarily the cost of A2 milk, but that's definitely, Katie, I'm sure can answer that. Maya,
so yeah, I can.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I can just chime in here. The price did recently change. So I want to get what the exact MSRP is, and that if it would be possible for me to share that along with any data that I might have around like just any transition to more A2 cows, I can definitely provide that as a follow-up.
And Katie, I can say in my local grocery store on the corner, the A2 is the same price as conventional milk. So it's not more expensive because because I buy it, so I know.
Yeah. All good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maya, for sharing some great information. Just 2 quick reminders to our attendees. This webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit, and the certificate of attendance will be sent out within the next 24 hours. And then also this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the RDBA website within 1 week. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Thanks, Maya, and thanks to A2 Milk for sponsoring this really informative webinar. Have a great day, you guys.